Horror movies are hugely popular, and during the pandemic, the genre has been attracting even larger audiences than ever before on streaming sites like Netflix. For example, Contagion, a long-running 2011 epidemic film, became one of the most watched offerings on Netflix at the start of the COVID era. But why did people flee to an alternative world full of fictitious horrors at a time when real horrors were plaguing the world? 5 reasons why horror films have a calming effect on their fans, especially during the pandemic. Survival training. Researcher Matthias Clausen from Aarhus University explains the popularity of horror films with evolutionary psychology approaches.
Horror appetite is an adaptive mechanism designed to allow viewers to experience negative circumstances and negative emotions at levels that could not be safely attained in real life,
writes Clausen. According to him, through the horror films, horror fans learn what it feels like to survive in the midst of catastrophes, how to deal with enemy species, and master other horror scenarios. In this way, the cinematic apocalypse becomes a training ground. So, from an evolutionary psychology perspective, watching horror movies might be useful because it encourages survival lessons and a survival mentality. The fact that the demand for such survival lessons increased, especially in times of the pandemic, reflected the seriousness of the situation and the uncertainty of the people. Anxiety control. According to a research group led by Gideon Nave from the University of Pennsylvania, horror fans are generally not thick-skinned, but even more neurotic and anxious than their fellow human beings. Maybe that's why they love the thrill of horror movies, because they can control it. Whether they're looking away, turning the lights on or off, turning off the sound, or watching the movie with friends and family, the many ways to dial up or down the frightening experience at any time give more anxious people a sense of control. While everyone often experienced a loss of control and helplessness in everyday life during the pandemic, horror fans were able to maintain the pleasant impression of being in control of the apocalypse on the screen even in the midst of the apocalypse. Free from expectations. In the real world, few people are comfortable admitting that they are scared or insecure, because in certain situations, for example at work, such sincerity can even lead to serious problems. It is completely different when enjoying horror films. Uncontrolled expressions of terror, such as a yelp or a wince, are not uncommon, and even in the presence of others, such as in the cinema, are perceived as normal and acceptable to some extent. The horror on screen allows adults not only to experience emotions unfiltered, but also to express them. This can be a positive and deeply liberating experience that is not possible elsewhere in everyday life. In the home cinema during the pandemic, mom and dad, who otherwise wanted to appear composed and strong in front of the children, were able to let go and fear uninhibitedly. Adult game. Fear and pleasure coexist in a very special way in recreational horror, write researchers led by Mark Mondorf Anderson, who also teaches at Aarhus University. They believe that watching horror movies is a form of adult play. For example, they observed an increased, but not dangerously increased heart rate in their volunteers during the gruesome conversation.
Similar to a child who reacts with excitement to being playfully chased by a caregiver, the viewer of a horror film playfully engages in a form of threat simulation,
say the researchers. As with gaming, watching scary movies is associated with a degree of insecurity, curiosity, and surprise that leads to positive feelings. The volunteers themselves also indicated that forms of fear-inducing entertainment, including horror films or visits to a haunted house, were a game. As such, the on-screen horror may have been a playful distraction from the seriousness of the pandemic. Morbid curiosity. Compared to their peers, horror fans were mentally more resilient, at least during the first phase of the pandemic. This is indicated by a study carried out by researchers led by Colton Scrivener from the University of Chicago in 2020. The horror fans felt less anxious and irritable than others, reports Scrivener. For example, they were able to sleep better and had fewer depressive symptoms. Among fans of the horror genre, Scrivener's team also identified individuals with so-called morbid curiosity, a personality trait previously associated with interest in horror films. Morbidly curious people have an above-average interest in unpleasant things, such as crime, and generally consider the world to be more dangerous than most. They, in particular, felt strengthened during the lockdown when watching films. The morbidly curious volunteers scored highest on the resilience questionnaires, regardless of their age and gender. Apparently, their fascination with the unreal horror helped them to ignore the real one.